Okay, so I'm Laurent Sarrazin, Head of Unit for Effective Development Policy and Team Europe at the European Commission. And I'm very pleased to welcome you all on behalf of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation to this roundtable on the question, does effective development cooperation really deliver development, and what can research tell us? I would particularly like to thank the participants in our roundtable discussion for making yourselves available. We are very lucky to have such a group of researchers with so much experience in looking at aid and development cooperation. We are having this discussion in a strange time where we have to do it virtually, which allows for a wider participation, certainly, but also shows how important the topic is. Development effectiveness is about achieving greater and more sustained impact and doing better with the resources we have. So the COVID-19 pandemic and the crisis it has led to makes effectiveness even more urgent and critical. The Global Partnership is convinced that an essential key to achieve greater effectiveness is to show how implementing the effectiveness principles in practice can and does deliver better development impact. Effectiveness approaches are able to deliver better development, but they also involve risks. They require negotiation and compromise, and they have longer time frames. So implementing effectiveness is not easy. It requires commitment, effort, and persistence. So to convince people and organizations to make the efforts and take the risks, we must be able to show the rewards, that they must be able to show that we invest in effectiveness, we will achieve greater, better, and more development impact. And that is why we've invited you here today. We want to promote more research on the practical implementation of the effectiveness principles in partner country at sector level, essentially, and show how it can improve development outcomes. And we would like to get your thoughts on how research should be focused and undertaken so that it is useful and influential. And with that in mind, we've put together a number of questions to structure the discussion, and I thank you in advance for your thoughts on those questions. I'm delighted that we have Stefan Klingebiel from the German Development Institute and now UNDP Seoul Policy Center to moderate the roundtable discussion, and I will now hand over to Stefan for opening the discussion. Stefan, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Laurent, and I would also like to welcome everybody to the Global Partnership Research Roundtable. I'm really glad to have the honor to moderate this discussion today. Just briefly to break the ice, I think this discussion is really about a very fundamental question in the area of development cooperation. It's about does aid work? And I think we are all aware about this famous report from drafted by Robert Kaysen and his team. And this question is still relevant, and we all know this question is not about yes or no response. It's much more that we need to have a differentiation what might be aspects of an answer. And just looking back over the last couple of years and decades, I think just to highlight few debates, we had those discussions around the focus on conditions in partner countries, and what Burnside Dollar published at the end of the 1990s. We know this is still very much sharpening many of our debates, and our way how we are selecting partner countries. One other discussion is around how aid should provide it. The Paris Declaration, all these other high-level events, this specific period in time when program-based approaches, budget support was very relevant, results-based aid as a modality, at least for a specific period. So this kind of the delivery aspect, and just a third thought on this. I mean, what we observe right now for the last couple of years is that yes, the aid context is very much changing for very different reasons. I mean, one aspect that many development cooperation partners, many providers of development cooperation are focusing on thematic areas, or you can also call it global public goods. Look at the migration debate for North America, for Europe, how much this is sharpening the discussion. We have much more impact of the climate finance and the overlap to ODA, and how this is also affecting our questions around aid and aid effectiveness. So what I want to say is, to some extent, the fundamental questions on effectiveness, on impact of development cooperation remain valid. At the same time, to a very large extent, the context, the situation we are working in is very much changing. And again, this background, I think it's a fantastic timing to discuss today what kind of research agenda is needed, what are gaps, what can we do in addition to get a better understanding about what we are doing. And I think exactly what Laurent is saying, that this should, of course, inform decision makers how to make development cooperation much more effective. We have not two, but even four great guiding questions, and I will come to the first one in a minute, but let me say that the challenge will be posed to 9 great panelists, and this is really great that the GPDC team was able to bring together those 9 great panelists. What we want to do is to have an interactive discussion, and we know about the limitations of online formats, and of course, if we have 9 great panelists, there are also a number of constraints. So we are trying to make it, a good combination of listening to what panelists are saying, also encouraging panelists to respond to each other, and also to provide the opportunity to make use of the Q&A and chat function. And so please, if you have any comment, any question, use the Q&A and chat function. Because we have 9 great panelists, I think my most important role as a moderator is to have a close eye on the time constraints. So I need to be quite strict. And for the first round, we agreed that for each panelist we have up to 3 minutes. Let me just say what the first question is for our panelists. This is, I think, really the basic question about what are the main gaps in the research on aid effectiveness and impact of development cooperation are. What are key research questions that need to be explored on the relationship between implementation of the effectiveness principles and improved development outcomes? So this is very much about the big picture of each panelist. How would you frame, how would you define the main gaps of research in this specific field. Let me just introduce to you our first panelist, and this is Dr. Tawasi Kida. She is Executive Director of the Economic and Social Research Foundation in Tanzania, and really great to have you with us today. So Tawasi, over to you, and after 3 minutes, I give you a hopefully kind reminder about the time. Over to you, Tawasi.
Thank you very much. I know we have only 3 minutes for this, and I will try to respond given the context of Tanzania. There are 3 points that I want to bring forward regarding the main gaps in research when coming to understand the aid modality. The first one is aid has been changing over time. In the 60s, for instance, here in Tanzania, we were focusing more on investment aid, and in the 80s, it changed to structure adjustment and through program support, and then later, mostly as a poverty support through GBS. And all this changing over time has had impact on understanding the modality and also the impact on aid. For instance, in Tanzania, we did, so there's been a changing, a shift and where aid has been channeled. At one point, it was mainly through the GBS, but then it changed through the direct project support. And this also can bring misconception, thinking that as the funding through GBS is decreasing, maybe aid is no longer as important. But here at ESRF, we did some work to look at the financing on social provision. And one could see that the impact or the relevance, on financing social service through project funding. So this understanding of changing of aid modality over time is really, really crucial, as also can mislead the policymakers. And then another thing is, what is the space of civil society and private sector when it comes to implementing different programs? You can see the case of agriculture sector here in Tanzania. Still, there is a shortage of funding when it comes to implementing, what has been planned. But then, how can the public and private come together, and what is the role of aid when it comes to implementing that? But the second point that I want to bring forward is the fragmenting objective between social and economic objective. During the HIPIC era, the focus, or the MDG, the focus was mainly toward the social objective. But when it comes, like recently in Tanzania, the focus is more on economic transformation. And how can we bring together these two portfolios so that we deliver what is intended?
20 seconds remaining.
Yes. So, and then another one is the space of local research institution in setting the agenda. So who determine the research agenda when it comes to these issues? And the need to have the space for local research agenda be determined also from the local perspective. So this is also very important.
Okay, thank you so much, Tawasi, for your initial statement. And I think you highlighted already a number of very important points. I see the relevance of program support and general budget support, and because of the decrease of GBS, that's the relevance, the importance of development cooperation as such is shrinking, and that's a quite important observation. And also the fragmentation between social and economic topics. So thank you so much for highlighting those aspects and many others. Let's continue with our second panelist, Sam Jones. He's a research fellow at Wider. Over to you, Sam.
Great, thanks very much, and appreciate the opportunity to be here. So yeah, so the question asked of us, just to get going, is where do we see the gaps in research on aid effectiveness and impact? And as a caveat, I would say that I'm approaching this from the lens of a development economist, and also more on the academic side. So that in a certain way limits the scope of my knowledge and also the kinds of proposals that I might put on the table. But broadly speaking, what has been the focus of economic research over, the last 30 years really, has been on the kind of first order question, which is, does aid work in terms of boosting economic growth and achieving other improvements in living standards? So that's really been a focus. We can discuss whether we have an answer to that or not, but I would say that at the moment continuing to this day, there's been much less attention to what conditions facilitate more or less effective aid. And one can ask then, why is that the case? Well, partly because the first question wasn't so easily resolved. To a certain extent, it is now. There's more convergence amongst economic researchers that aid generally does, on average, have these positive impacts, but there's a lot of question marks about when, where, and how. But the difficulty is also moving into more complex measurement problems and data issues. Take one example, country ownership. Okay, if we can all agree in principle that this is important, but how do we actually measure country ownership from an economic or quantitative perspective? And I think that is one reason that once you move into these, what might be called more, more fuzzy, more subjective concepts that are going to look different in different areas, then the scope for quantitative research, at least, is going to be much more limited. And you might also say that from the point of view of academic incentives as well, academic economics researchers would be more interested in doing this kind of quantitative research, particularly research that we call as well identified, where you can identify a causal impact here and there. And that becomes much more difficult when you have these data issues. So, I know I only have a couple of more seconds left. So just what can be done? So I think, I think there is, however, a missing ingredient in some of this discussion, which is some of the fundamental conditions and incentives facing particularly the recipients of aid. So, what's the demand side for aid? The previous speaker noted that, in many contexts, aid is actually reducing, it's falling in importance as a share of GDP and in terms of a budget share. So how do recipients benefit from that? And what's the incentive structure facing them to also to align with these principles? So I think that's a point where I would leave it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam, for highlighting very important points about data issues, how to measure important dimensions or principles like ownership, yes, and I mean this term incentive system is a very important one, just beside many other aspects you were talking about. So thank you for this, Sam. Let's turn to Dr. Heiner Janus, researcher at the German Development Institute. And Heiner, over to you and your 3 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much, Stefan. Also, just to kick off, 3 points from my side. So my first point would be that I don't think that there are like major gaps necessarily, but that I would see the need to bring together different strands of effectiveness discussions. And in my understanding, I think we're talking about at least 4 kind of distinct communities that deal with effectiveness questions in research, but also in policy making. So we mentioned the macro side of long-term questions of aid impact on economic growth, for instance. Second community would be the GPEDC principles as a kind of set of best practices, what development actors can subscribe to, accountability, transparency, and so forth. The third community for me is the organizational side, so bureaucratic effectiveness. How do development actors structure themselves, but also in partner countries, how do bureaucracies work? And then the fourth one is for me the intervention level. How does a specific aid modality work in terms of generating impacts, improvements in people's lives? And all these answers to the questions of how aid works are kind of being discussed in different communities. So my first point would be to link this together. My second point is that the focus of this session on the sector level and on the modalities is already a good example where you could do that. So we know a lot about the effectiveness of budget support. We followed the evolution to kind of more modern modalities. It's still very much about program versus projects. But how are these modalities embedded in kind of organizational structures? How do they interact with the local context? What type of actors are involved? How does this look like from a perspective of a macro allocative efficiency? And what kind of like real causal impacts can you show on the ground? So you could look at this modality question across all these four communities. And I think it's more about connecting the knowledge that we have there. And then my last and final point is, apart from these details of having kind of a holistic perspective on effectiveness, I think politics is really the elephant in the room. So across all of these areas, political questions are key and need to be addressed by research as well. So the question of who participates in a sector dialogue is a political question. Are emerging donors at the table? China, India, do they participate in existing formats? Is the dialogue multi-stakeholder, like is it democratic and open? Or are there specific groups and countries that prevent this type of dialogue from happening? So I think across all these areas, these political challenges need to factor into our research on aid effectiveness. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Heiner. Perfect time management and very important points. Really interesting to learn about those four research communities, and I think would be also quite interesting to use this later on, how to link them, and do colleagues agree with that we have those, you were not saying silos, but those four communities with little interfaces, that would be quite interesting. And and the political economy aspects of aid effectiveness, very important aspects. So thank you so much, Heiner. Let's turn to Johnny Flento, Senior Advisor at the University of Copenhagen. And Johnny, what is your view about most important research gaps on aid effectiveness? Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I would like to continue from where the previous speaker left. For me, it's very much an issue of who is doing this sort of stakeholder analysis. I think would be very important. The concept is a very strong logic, but it's based on idealistic assumptions. So if the situation could be established such as it is described, then I'm sure that outcomes would reflect it. But development cooperation to support and pursue partner countries' own development policies, when those priorities are agreed in an inclusive and equitable way, and external support is combined with national efforts and delivered through national institutions and systems, then we achieve greater, better, and more development impact. I think the question is not really so much to find out whether this is true. It is rather to look at to which extent has this situation ever existed? Have we been even close? Can we show that when the assumptions are more fulfilled, the outcomes are better and vice versa? And I think even in the sort of post-Cold War and unipolar world when this was conceived, it is fair to say that the concept of aid effectiveness was based on a very simplified model of stakeholders in development cooperation. So an ideal to be pursued, strongly advocated by brilliant people in a geopolitical atmosphere that exerted very strong pressure through international meetings and declarations on stakeholders to get in line. And many went along without too much conviction, I think. I would not say that some countries faked it, but I can refer to a phenomenon known by the biologist as isomorphic mimicry. It is when a harmless animal looks very much like a very dangerous relative and obtains some protection or advantage from this fact. For instance, when you have a very non-venomous snake looking like a very poisonous one, it will scare its predators, but it cannot hunt like a venomous snake. So we have a situation where everybody went along, took part in all the meeting, and it looked right. But the issue of not really walking the talk, I think, is true for both donors and recipient countries. I could tell many stories, also as 15-year head of the agency in some of the allegedly most harmonized countries. But I have never known a situation where some of the players did not try to sub-optimize a part of the system to help themselves. So I think it's very important to say, did this situation really exist, and to which extent did it? Also because this model will be much more challenged in the future, as it's pointed out in some of the written works of some of the scholars in this panel, pointing to the much more... Yeah, so we have which aspects of the described situation, the ideal described situation, will exist in the future, or which part of the ideal can we possibly save when much more and much more heterogeneous donors come along. And I think the really important point is about technical assistance, because that is where we very much embed conditionality. Can we de-link technical assistance from conditionality? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johnny, for very additional points to our discussion. I think your reflection about the combination of commitment and ownership on the partner country side and to combine it with external support is an important one. And if I would be not the moderator, I would ask how about those countries where we do not have committed leadership in place? Might be also a relevant question for later on. And yeah, this not walking the talk is also from a research perspective, I think, an important challenge, how to work on this. So thank you so much, Johnny, for this. Let me turn to Dr. Deb Bhattacharya. He is Distinguished Fellow at the Center for Policy Dialogue in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and also very much involved in Southern Voice research on development cooperation effectiveness. Deb, great to have you with us, and your time is running now.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Let me thank the organizers for inviting me to this very distinguished group of people. I'm very appreciative of that. I'm also appreciative of the fact that the issue of development effectiveness has been resurrected in the post-COVID circumstances, and we are discussing the possibility of having a much more robust and rigorous analysis about the impact of or the relationship of effectiveness to development in particular. The whole introduction reminds me my 3 decades back interaction with Robert Casson in my Queen Elizabeth House days, 3 decades back, and 2 decades back, Dollar Carey report on the growth, whether it helps the poor or not. In both cases, as you will see in the big one, the answer is very predictable. The answer is, it depends. The issue is what it depends on in certain circumstances. That is how you really find that out. So the first and foremost issue is we need to see how the contextual realities, the national circumstances, the sectoral attributes, and the stakeholder engagements are all included in that. What is the depending factor? What are the determining factors? If the colleagues are thinking about taking it forward as an analytical study to see whether effective development cooperation delivers development or not, I just mentioned 3 or 4 points to conclude my this intervention, that what would be necessary to find out. First and foremost is to be very sure about the objective and scope of the work. So the objective is to only to justify or also not to justify. So that has to be very clear, that whether the studies are going to see only the effective cases or non-effective cases, or is a random selection where it comes out what are the circumstances under which one is effective and another is not. And the scope of it is very important, because whether when we say development cooperation, and if it is the GPEDC terminology, then we are talking about either the ODA and OOF, not any other forms of development cooperation beyond the concession of finance. So the instruments of choice would be very, very clear in these cases. I can go on how the scope has to be delimited in order to have an effective study. The second and foremost issue would be having an analytical framework, because each of these studies, if they pursue on their own, will not be comparable at the end of the day, and will end up with the conclusion that each of them depends on their current circumstances. So an analytical framework which establishes the essential elements of comparability and at the same time allows the flexibility for contextual realities will be very, very important. And in this case, so what is important also would be the choice of the sector and the choice of the countries, because if you do not have critical dependence on that particular flow of finance, it is very difficult to do attribution even at a project level. If not, definitely it will be difficult at sector level, definitely out of question at macro level, to see the relationship between, yes, and the relationship between these two in that way. So analytical framework is very critical to have robustness. And last but not the least is, of course, the data. The issue is that if we move from the analysis of effectiveness of development cooperation, from the process analysis to the output analysis, or the impact of the product analysis, outcome analysis, then the issue of data will become very, very important, particularly from the SDG perspective. Left behind issue, the disaggregated real time, and the COVID has really given the new challenge to this particular issue. So that was my general point. If we want to move with the research, we need to have a clearer idea about the objective and scope, then about the analytical framework, and definitely the data issue. Thank you very much, Stephen, for being so kind.
Thank you so much, Deb, for very important points. I'm not going to summarize what you already presented, but very important ideas about the analytical framework, and also your framing about the role of data. Yeah, so thank you so much for this. And just to highlight, I'm not able to follow all comments in the chat and Q&A function. But there seems to be a very lively debate, so that's really great to see. Okay, let's turn to our next panelist, Yameli Mustalati from the University of Eastern Finland. Yameli, really great to have you with us, and please go ahead.
Yes, thank you for the invitation and greetings from Finland. I would like to go back to this snake, which my colleague from Copenhagen mentioned, that we are actually now in the era of the bigger snake than what we can swallow. And if we look to the era of climate change and these current concerns, we are living not only relation to climate change, but to COVID also. The term concept of aid effectiveness doesn't hold in research anymore. The way how we should look, not, of course, I come from the research academic side, so I'm also a bit critical the way how we are financing, but also carry out the research. We should not only measure or monitoring or study the aid effectiveness, but we should actually invest the time and study how to make the change together. And this requires the very different funding modalities, but also the research methods, what we are currently utilizing. For example, once we talk about the co-creating the knowledge, we cannot talk about the sector-based research. We cannot look the research interventions and study the 8 impacts, unexpected and expected impacts, only from the one sector point of view. We, as a researchers, we are also responsible to look the interlinkages, those impacts which are not in that specific sector, but are in the broader in the society. And this requires the new approach, more action-oriented, more co-creation, more open data, more open sources. And it requires a more collaboration, not only among those specific ministries we are working with in the partner countries, in those specific research institutions which we are collaborating. But it also requires that type of dialogue and multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral networks, collaboration and dialogues, which requires the new methods, new research functions, and completely different type of attitude what we are doing. It's the dialogue, it's the collaboration, it's the terms of the working together, openly sharing the information, not protecting our own innovations and so on. And it's a very paradigm shift, not only among of us, the researchers, but it also paradigm shift in those institutions who are hiring us or financing us. The way how we need to create the new research projects, these are not the 2 years. These are something longer periodical, which also requires the new thinking from the funding organizations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily, and your discussion around funding, methodological approach, how to come to a point where we can have joint research generation. I think those points are really very fundamental, and great to see that our questions later on will give to you the opportunity to present to us more details about your thinking, how to make it happen, what you are asking for. So let's turn to Ms. Jane Mariara. Jane is professor at the University of Nairobi, and she's also executive director of Partnership for Economic Policy. So really great to have you with us, Jane. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. So maybe I'll give more of my views from the point of PEP, also noting that we seem to concur with some of the speakers, especially the first one on some of the questions. But just first note that actually the way we see it is that the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation actually came at the right time, and it was an important step forward in reaching a consensus towards application of effectiveness principles. But of course, we know that there are a lot of challenges that have come to test this for effective cooperation. We've seen the global financial crisis, a lot of migration, especially from the South, rising threats of climate change, widening inequalities, and of course, now most important, COVID-19. So it means that even when we are looking at all these, then we ask ourselves whether policymakers are still able to commit their time effectively and their resources to the principles of effectiveness, or whether they have actually been diverted by these challenges. And really, the question that we must ask then is how the adherence of development cooperation to the principles of effectiveness delivers better development impact in the light of these challenges. So then I have maybe 3 quick questions that I would say that from the PEP perspective would focus on. First is to ask ourselves whether funders have been successful in giving space to developing countries, that is the global south, and allowing them to set their own strategies? Do we still have conditionalities? Are we allowing the global south to actually set their own agenda as far as these principles of effectiveness are concerned? Second, I would note that even after so many years of this subject being discussed, why is it, as maybe the first speaker mentioned, the understanding of civil society organizations still remains weak? And this brings in the question whether it's the capacity of the civil society organizations to demand reform, which is still weak, or whether it has actually been eroded by the political economy aspects, the political factors. Because for sure, we note that the Southern community-based organizations are playing a very small role compared maybe to international CSOs or international NGOs who actually tend now to come and compete with the local community
20 seconds.
Organizations. Yes, and finally, there's the issue of the SDGs, and maybe just to say that the critical question with the SDGs that I can ask, or we look at PEP, is to ask ourselves, what role can global partnership and international community and forums of global governance play to ensure that we can bring SDGs on track? Because we know that, again, for SDGs, the global partnership has been hindered by weak local level capacities and political economy issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane, for those points. Very fundamental aspects about, conditionality, civil societies, and how to deliver on the SDGs, and what is the role of making aid effective with this kind of orientation. So thank you so much for this. Let me turn to Mr. Jose Jaime Macuan, probably very poor pronunciation, sorry for this. Jose, you're a professor in Maputo, Mozambique, and we are looking forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you for having me in this panel with these great people here analyzing development aid. Obviously, it is a bit difficult at this point to say something new because of all the relevant things that have been already said. But what I would say, maybe picking from the last intervention, is to say that in my perspective, the biggest weakness, it's the process, it's the political economy that surrounds research on aid effectiveness. Obviously, there are two layers or even more. The first one would be that layer of academic research, but there is one which is much more influential in my point of view, which is very critical to look at, is what is the kind of knowledge that is being generated about aid effectiveness, which has been actually the set of various studies that have been carried out at the level of the programming exercise by donors, which unfortunately and paradoxically is not available for a wider debate. And I think that the kind of knowledge that comes out from this process is very crucial for understanding a key point that has been already raised here, which has to do with the political economy of all this process. I mean, in terms of the power relations of actors, countries, and also internal dynamics that occur and which have implications in terms of how development aid can be effective, on how it interacts with the institutions, with actors, and all this aspect. I think that this is a considerable gap because this knowledge has not been shared, this knowledge has not been discussed, and this knowledge is shared in a context of asymmetric power relations, in the sense that some people, in the case donors, know much more about what happens than, for example, recipient countries. So I think that this reflects a very important element in terms of the political economy of the past. And this, in my point of view, has to do also with the areas where I think would be very important for all the actors to know. For example, aid operates in a context of at least two or even multiple governance settings. I mean, the recipient countries, the donor countries, and also the overall system. And people in the recipient countries, most of the time, do not know the dynamics of governance that occur, for example, in donor countries. For example, how accountability relation policy process can have implications in terms of the volume of aid and even focus. I think that this is a very important element which is not available for all that. So I would say that it's very important to have this knowledge shared and also open the space for the recipient countries to have access to this kind of knowledge that has been generated, but that is not shared. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jose. Very, very relevant points about the process and political economy. I think this is really, really important. Also, this kind of insight as an illustration, what you mentioned, that in many recipient countries, the accountability rationale of donor countries are not really well known, and this might have an impact on how partner countries might find a good and appropriate strategy. Thank you so much for this. Let me turn to our last but not least panelist, Finn Tarp, professor at the University of Copenhagen, and also somebody who is very well known for a number of macro-analytical pieces on this fundamental question, what is the relationship between aid and economic growth beside other topics. Finn, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you this afternoon. Let me say that I think that there's a lot of reason to move on in the development cooperation effectiveness debate, not because first order questions have not been addressed. They have been addressed quite convincingly. There are quite solid rebuffs of Burnside and Dollar and Rajan and Subramanian available through rather major research programs. So it's actually on that basis that I would suggest that we now move on. It's very clear that I find it highly pertinent to ask how one increases the development cooperation impact and efficiency. This is particularly relevant when one looks at the collapse of the Paris Declaration and the agreements reached in Accra and Busan, etc. Why is that? Why did they collapse? Because I've been in a host of meetings over the past year with very well-meaning development and cooperation officials. And what have they explained? Well, they have explained that they are now essentially in a game of competing for visibility as a donor, not in a game of promoting coordinated, complementary, and effectful cooperation. Why is that? And what does it mean and imply? What are the real incentive mechanisms involved on the donor side? Sam made reference to the fact that it's important to understand both the supply and the demand side, and he focused on the demand side. I think it's relevant to call attention to the supply side. Yes, moving beyond the bigger issue of macroeconomic impact of aid, but then looking at the supply side. What does that mean? Well, that means that we have to try somehow to come to grips with what goes on. What are the incentives on the donor side to try to uncover, in maybe quite frank terms, the underlying interests and priorities at play? And I fear that they have a long way to go to be in line with stability, predictability, and long-term needs, which we know are crucial for effectiveness. So I think that it would be nice if we could move forward, and this is my final point, whether donors are in practice ready to promote donor ownership in a true sense, not as sort of an overall fluffy concept, but in specific contractual rights and obligations sense. Unpacking this would take a very close, deep, and very frank and independent look at inside interests and priorities of donor agencies, at the very many different levels. It would be interesting to know whether you would think that this would be indeed feasible and a feasible undertaking in today's world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Finn, for those reflections. And I think this is really very relevant to see that from your point of view, a lot is known. And so it's not so much that we are missing a lot of information, but it's rather we know that something with the incentive system on the donor side needs to be fixed. That's my summary of what you are saying, and this is very important, not at least against the background of the research you did for many years. So thank you so much. This is great. So we have 9 great insights on the topic, what we should talk about. And I'm not trying to present to you already a summary, but I think what is very clear is that you are using very different perspectives how to frame the topic, and I think this is also what is needed. I think there's not a one right perspective, but many ways how to approach this challenge. So that's good. But maybe to make it a bit more concrete, what does it mean for a possible potential future research agenda? Let's move on to the second question. This is a how question, I would say. So is there a research interest in exploring those questions you were just raising, and how can interest be stimulated and translated into a robust evidence base on the impact of aid effectiveness? So what are your ideas how to frame this kind of research agenda? I think I could ask all of you, but maybe I just pick some of the statements, and for example, Sam, you might have some more concrete ideas how this kind of research agenda might look like. So you presented to us your economic framing of the topic. Do you have any brief idea how to frame it?
Oh, these are pretty tough questions. I mean, I think there's potentially some low, not necessarily low hanging fruit. I mean, from a quantitative perspective, I mean, there are some opportunities perhaps to be able to, use databases such as aid data to start categorizing aid by certain modalities, and to use that to link in the broader kind of macro type style literature to say, well, okay, if we split aid into program support versus projects, can we do that? If we can do that in a rigorous way, I mean, that's the question mark, whether that can be done effectively. But then one can look at differences in aid effectiveness, I mean, across these different modalities. I mean, these are potential lines of inquiry. One could also use, and I noted on the chat, for instance, the quality of aid, which CGD, I mean, the quality of ODA index, perhaps one might be able to use that in the same kind of fashion, applying some of the weights to the aid. Let's imagine that you have $100 of aid, but if your quality of aid index is very low, and that effectively means $20 of aid, so there are some potential avenues to explore whether the data is of sufficiently high quality and of sufficient length of time to be able to do that. I couldn't tell you off the bat. And I think, I mean, the other way, from an economics perspective, perhaps, that one could start looking into some of these other issues about incentives and alignment is, one could actually think about, doing some work directly with either aid recipients, as in members of parliament and so on, or aid officials in the development corporations, to understand how they behave when faced with some of these quite challenging incentive compatible problems. I mean, there's a lot of research now using experimental methods or kind of laboratory games. One could perhaps reflect on how could one bring in, let's say, development recipients, officials within developing countries, and how do they reveal their preferences to an aid donor when they know that the aid donor is only willing to fund certain types of projects, for instance. So, I mean, there's a few things that one can think about. I don't have, the full list of perfect ideas on the plate, but I think those are a couple of ideas. Over.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sam. And I think that's really good, to go this step further to have a better understanding how this research might look like. Let me just pick one other panelist for this question, and then I would briefly open the discussion, but just to address the different perspectives of our topic today. Deb, you were discussing the contextual need for research we are doing. Maybe you can give a bit more indications what you are thinking about. How can this kind of research be done? And this is also quite a challenge, I think. So, Deb, any brief additional ideas on this?
Stefan, are you asking me to comment from the research side? There is a, I think that...
Emily and Tawasi, I will come to you in a minute. I was just asking Deb, and happy to give you the floor, Emily and Tawasi, later on. Thank you.
So thank you, Stefan. I have heard my colleagues using the word donor. Donor has a specific connotation in development cooperation. It means that you are giving money as a grant, essentially grant, and bilateral aid is essentially grant in most of the cases, apart from the technical assistance. So the scope of the work gets very narrowed down to bilateral aid coming as grant. So, if you use the word donor, but if you use the word development partner, then you have a wide-ranging providers, starting from multilateral to various others who are not giving necessarily grant in aid. So please, we need to be careful about what terminology we use over here. Coming back on the issue of effectiveness, what is the important part is that whether we are looking, one of the major shortcomings of the effectiveness debate is it was stuck within the process. It didn't really leak into the outcomes. So if we want to look into the outcomes, the issue is in what form we want to see the outcomes embodied. Do you see at the household level? Do you see at the sector level? Do you see at the national economic level? So that has to be seen. Now, it has to be related also to the input, because with a small input, you cannot expect a big macroeconomic impact. Then it has to be much more disaggregated, concrete, and at a certain level, sector or project and other things over there. That is the other. On your contextual reality, you see, it has been said that it is the supply side factors which are important in framing the issues. I agree on the issue of incentives and others, but I do not think that without looking at the demand side situation, you can really look into the effectiveness, because the issue of flow of foreign aid should start with the national demand, because that is how it should be, not because some good country wanted to help with the health or the education sector. It's because these countries needed that help, and they have articulated that in certain ways in the plan documents and other ways. So it is the demand side factor, and the demand side factor becomes much more important when we see the utilization rate falters because of various capacities or bureaucratic reasons, etc. So we cannot really assess the effectiveness without looking at the demand side factors simultaneously. that brings in the contextual realities, including the political cycle and other issues. I can continue on that, but thank you very much. But I'm trying to impress upon you colleagues is that they're getting a robust analytical framework for pursuing the study is the first step towards doing the study. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb, for this.
And just one or 10 seconds. And there had been these ideas from my colleague Jones, Sam Jones was mentioning about looking into aid data and other things. Colleagues, we have all looked into this data. This is, if you can do a meta-analysis, it is fine. Otherwise, what is important is to look at the reality on the grounds, more national case studies, and bringing in the national data system into play and see how it really explains the situation. Otherwise, all those things, the macro data, the aid data, which is available with OECD or with the aid data and other places, these have been really dealt with by most of the professionals in this case.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deb. Tawasi, you raised your hand. Tawasi, over to you. You have the floor.
Oh.
Maybe Tawasi, you just work on this issue, this technical issue, and Emily can go first, and then Tawasi. Emily?
Yes, these are very, very good points from the previous speakers, because what is important to understand that why we are doing these evaluations, why we are doing this research. Is it just done in order to doing well? Is it just done in order to measure something in order that donors are able to do something better? Or is these studies done in order to support the well-being, support those processes which are ongoing in those countries? There was one question from the audience as well, that how would you reframe this type of research where you co-create the knowledge, but also this question of the shared responsibility of these interventions and the research related to those? Because what we have been studying, for example, in relation to various type of environmental interventions, when those are measured very quantitative way, yes, you can see the certain type of numbers, you can see the certain type of impacts, but at the same time there is a certain type of phenomenon which we are calling as responsibilization. That it's actually the number shows that so and so many things have been happening and very well, but actually when you go deeper to actual context, you recognize that these interventions have been giving a lot of responsibilities to the local level, what the people are actually not able to carry. From the well-doing point of view, these projects are doing well. But if you look, for example, critically, what type of situations for the certain communities living close to the forest areas where have been supported, these communities are actually carrying a lot of responsibilities, which actually should be carrying the completely different institutions than, for example, the village councils or the village community groups. So, and these type of issues you do not get through the numbers. You need the different methods. You need the contextual understanding. You need the really close collaboration with the local institutions, not in the ministries, not in the capital cities, but there where these interventions are carried out.
Thank you so much, Emily. If I may, just one quick follow-up question also to you, because you mentioned this question, how we finance research on aid effectiveness, and I think this is not the technical way how you meant it, but rather what are the implications for our focus, etc.
Yes. Yeah.
1 or 2 sentences on this in addition would be quite interesting for our how question.
Yes, because it also relates to one of these questions which came from the audience, that this type of research which you create the knowledge together, which you are actually looking critically, it doesn't happen overnight. It's not done with the measuring through the databases or the test study. It actually requires the long-term contextual studies. It requires the group of the collaboration with the local institutions, and also where the us, the partners, collaborators are coming from. So we are not talking about the 10 days evaluations, which, for example, I'm sure that somebody from our ministry is listening this as well, but it means that these projects, also the research needs to be integrated to implementation of these support modalities. And
okay, thank you so much.
It's not happening yet.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you. Tawasi, I was able to see you.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes,
I think
I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Yes, on the how part, I just wanted to stress on the issue of fragmentation, as the present conditions require rethinking on how it all fits together, rather than fragmenting issues and checking effectiveness on piece by piece. So this, I think, will require rethinking analytical frameworks and combining with concrete understanding of local conditions, as no one shoe fits it all. So there is a need for combining that, the frameworks and the concrete understanding.
Okay, thank you so much, Tawasi. And I think this is really a very underlying aspect of research we need to do on this topic. Yeah, thank you for this. I have 2 more. Let's continue with Heiner.
I think Sam was first, but
yeah, but Sam was already speaking on this topic.
Good.
So this is why I gave you a bit more priority.
Okay, thanks. So my comment would be that I think in setting out this research agenda, it would be really critical to formulate some type of theory of change that captures, kind of basic underlying assumptions in a transparent way, and at the same time covers some of the main dimensions that were raised by the various speakers, on the demand side, supply side, participation of local actors. How would that work together in kind of one big chain that you can study? And then what type of knowledge and expertise would you need to address these questions? I mean, sure, it has to be co-created with people who have knowledge at all different levels, but that type of knowledge might be located in very different places. I mean, you need different disciplines, different type of theories on how to analyze this kind of like long chain of decisions that gets made, that goes into affecting development cooperation. So I think this kind of theory of change would be the first big point. And then the second point, if you think forward to the uptake of these findings, what is then, how do you envision those findings to then influence, decision makers or other academics? And I think in that regard, you would have to think, at what level do you then focus on your messaging? Do you try to cover something of everything? Do you try to, give recommendations for the incentive system of donor bureaucracies? Do you also cover kind of like the level of implementation and negotiations that happen around big aid programs? How do you bring in kind of the macro perspective? And then, within different development organizations, within those organizations themselves, you will have very different departments being able to take up those type of findings, evaluation departments, strategy departments, monitoring units, people who design instruments of development cooperation. So to think about in those uptakes terms, who is then the audience? I think that's kind of the second key point.
Okay, thank you, Heiner. So let's say two last interventions on question number 2. And I still manipulate the speakers list. So let's continue with Jane and then Sam.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll be brief, maybe just to pick up on what has already been raised. I have 3 points here. First, it's the participation of Southern researchers. Yes, there's interest in research, but then we find that there's little participation of Southern researchers. And yet, they are the ones maybe who understand better the local context. So that needs to be looked into. Whether it's through collaboration or networking with Northern researchers, but really to address these issues on the ground, we need the Southern researchers. Second, it is the need to improve, of course, the quality of research, especially from the Southern think tanks who have better links to policy anyway. Because you see the Southern think tanks have better links to the policy, and yet if the local research is not of very good quality, then the question is, how then do you ensure that we get better quality research, both qualitative, both quantitative, and then link it to policy? And really, this is what Partnership for Economic Policy, my organization, tries to do, including the co-production of knowledge that was mentioned. We've actually do pair ensure that for every research project that we are supporting, we have government officers who are linked with scientific researchers, so that as the scientists are looking at the research questions, then the government team are looking at the policy questions from the beginning, so that in the end, we ensure that the research fits into policies. And finally, of course, I'll just say that overall, we need globally coordinated efforts if we are actually going to be able to solve problems of global systematic concerns, whether it's climate change, whether it's SDGs, then we must really first ask ourselves, how do we start from the top, maybe from the north or from the global level, then come to the national and subnational levels if we are going to be able to solve the problems at the ground level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. And some of those aspects you just mentioned, we will dig a bit deeper when we come to the questions 3 and 4. Thank you for this. Let's also listen again to Sam. Sam, some additional thoughts on the how question?
Yes, I'll be quick because I don't want to monopolize. I just wanted to come back on this issue about, the role of perhaps economic or quantitative research. I mean, I don't think anyone's claiming that this is going to be the only way that one can answer these questions. But it is important because, if we're interested in finding an answer to what evidence is there that aid delivery matters, then I think some kind of more, let's say, general or broader sweep quantitative analysis is also useful. So it's about complementing different methodologies, not having one monopoly. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sam, for this additional thought. Let's turn to question number 3, and let me actually make a proposal for the remaining a bit less than 45 minutes. I would propose that we combine question number 3 and 4, and I think there is some overlap, and we are addressed already some aspects. So I propose to combine it and to give to each of you the floor for 1 or 2 minutes to just address those aspects of the 2 questions you want to choose. So please be selective. Don't try to cover everything. And then we would take some questions from the audience. Yenan is going to summarize it for us, and then you should have a last chance to respond to those questions from the chat and Q&A function. That would be my proposal. And let me just let you know what we want to know from you under question number 3 and 4. So question number 3 is what research institutions are best placed to contribute, and how can perspectives and research institutions from partner countries can effectively be involved in the research agenda. And I think this is already what many of you mentioned, Jane and others. I think this is a very fundamental question. It's and this is not just about formality, but this is also very much about the content. Yeah, also about what many of you mentioned already, that what research is doing should lead to some kind of implications for policymakers. So to have research institutions with a diverse background is something fundamental, and I think that would be really important to get ideas from your side how to make it happen. And question number 4 is, how can research products become more influential and better inform decision-making on development cooperation policies and practices? And I think this is also something what many of you were already addressing, that research should be action-oriented. The theory of change, we want to know how change might happen, so we need to have a good understanding about decision makers. So those are the 2 last questions, big questions to you. And let me just ask you who would like to start. Or let me just turn around the initial order, and we would start with Finn. Finn, do you have some thoughts on those 2 questions? Maybe not more than 1 or 2 minutes.
Sure, thank you very much. Let me first of all say that I think that Heiner made a good point. I would put it maybe slightly different, but one needs to take a look at the total system. And then depending on which elements of the total system that one wants to research, that would then lead to understanding which are the research institutions that are best placed to contribute. But I mean, one would need to sort of come up with, how can I say, answers to which are the elements of the system that you want to address before you can sort of speak about which are the research institutions that are best placed. Because it all depends on the question that you want to have kind of answered. I mean, for me, and by the way, let me add here that I will reserve my right to continue to speak about donors, because what I was actually trying to convey is that they sometimes behave as donors rather than as development partners. And I think that that's exactly part of something that we want to try to see whether we cannot push forward and discuss such that effectiveness could be improved. Let me then add, how can perspectives and research institutions from partner countries be effectively involved? We cannot do research, proper research, effective research, if this is not a partnership, if this is not almost like a marriage. And I don't ask my wife whether she wants to, how she can best be involved. I take it for granted that she is involved in a completely partner way, such that we jointly move forward. Unless we do it in that way, we're not going to be effective. Now, on the 4th set of questions, it's very, very hard for me to address that in a simple way. I mean, the RECOM experience shows how difficult it is. This requires that one very carefully builds in from the very outset a communication strategy that involves both the suppliers of the research as well as the recipients of the research. If you wish, the supply and demand side again, to be effective in terms of uptake of the research, it needs to be built in from the very, very beginning, such that both sides are prepared to move forward together. I think that's sort of to reflect on some of the brief messages is what I would try to convey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Finn. Very, very important. Thank you. Jose, over to you.
Thank you, Stefan. I think the most of the points Finn has already flagged, but I just wanted to come back to this idea of involving Southern. I think that it's not only about involving institutions, specific institutions, but is the approach adopted in the sense that these partners, institutions in the global south must be involved in a way that they create effective capacity to continue doing relevant research, including on aid effectiveness. So it's not only about being part of teams and where they can reproduce relations of power that we know that exists also in the academia, but that can be effective in terms of creating analytical capacity, policy analytical capacity in these countries. And this also has to do with the analytical frameworks. It's not only about power about it, but it's the way you define concepts, because sometimes the way you do it in a particular perspective from a standpoint which also has implications in the kind of analysis that you do and also in the kind of results that you get, and consequently also in the way you use those results and how relevant they are for the various audience. And I think that Anna has put it very sharply. The way you use research and you make it relevant, it will depend on the kind of audience. And Professor Finn was very accurate that involving this demand side is very important. I would fully agree with that. But I think that it's very important for us to pay attention to the power relations that also exist in the area of research and how we frame the whole process. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jose. Jane, what are your thoughts about this?
Okay, thank you very much. Just adding on to what my colleagues have said, but maybe being also a little bit more specific. And sorry, I think I had alluded to this in the previous question. I believe that Southern think tanks have a big role to contribute, because you're asking what research institutions are best placed to contribute. And I gave an example of PEP, and I'll say that what we believe is that local evidence or locally based maybe researchers at the institutions would be in a best place to produce evidence, because then they are on the ground and they know the development outcomes that are really needed. And to make this maybe effective, or how effectively they can be involved, what we believe at PEP is that if we can help these Southern researchers or Southern countries maybe to acquire the right skills, first for analytical capacity, and then also now linking this very clearly to policy, ensure that they have the right tools, they can ask the right questions, because as you're saying with development cooperation, you want something that is sustainable. So we believe that we need to equip the researchers and then allow them, researchers and policymakers, and then allow them to go and make change back at home and ensure that that change is sustainable. And in that respect, then we have that kind of co-production of knowledge, but to ensure that then it will resort to high quality, contextualized and policy relevant evidence. And of course, we are not alone. We know there are other organizations. I think Southern Voice is represented here, and it's mentioned. I think it's one very good example of other organizations that are doing that very well, or maybe even better. We know about Global Development Network. We have Asian Development Bank think tanks network. We have the African Economic Research Consortium, and so forth. So I believe there are organizations that are trying to do this, and they just need to be supported so as to make a difference. On the fourth question, very briefly, on the products.
Jane, sorry, otherwise, if I don't stop you, we will not make the full circle. So sorry for this. Maybe for the final round, you can bring in some additional thoughts. Yeah, sorry for stopping you, but I need to be a bit more strict with you. So sorry for this.
No problem.
Emily, please, your brief insight on this.
Yes, I think that what already the others highlighted, that it's very important that it's the collaboration between these various institutions. But I would still like to highlight a bit further this Jose Maguane from Mozambique, what you were also raising up, this we could use the capacity building or education, these institutions who are locally there, so that they can also create their own capacities to teach and make sure that this information is spreading and impacting later on as well. And so my proposal is that whatever modalities are planned or funded, that you are not separating the research and education. Because the education, once we deal with the 8 impacts or studying the 8 modalities, the education is the way how we practice a message, how we are impacting in those countries which we are working with, but also these countries which are funding the aid or aid research.
Thank you so much, Emily. Deb, your brief reflection on those questions.
So, Stefan, for me, the issue of Southern think tanks participation is a foregone conclusion. As you know, I'm the founding chair of the Southern Voice Network across 3 continents. So the whole issue is about the global knowledge system. The power relationship starts with the global knowledge system, and how you really formulate your research questions, what type of data you look at, how you interpret them. All these are power relationship at the end of the day. So I was under the impression that it will be the Southern think tanks who should be delivering these things, because the governance of this particular idea, how do you really structure it, will be very critical. Because if it comes from the GPEDC outfit and or those who the so-called donors, then obviously there is a serious conflict of interest, that whether the independence of the study will be compromised or not in that sense. Because those who fund the studies are usually calls the conclusions, and what are the protections in these cases which will be there. You know, this is a well-trodden territory. It is not in 2021 we are thinking about these things. We have gone through decades with all these things. So my general point is that you'll, along with the analytical robustness of the analytical techniques, along with the implementation, the governance of the study itself will be of no less importance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deb. Johnny, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I am not in a position to say which institutions would be more well placed, but I can maybe relate to number 4 question, which I agree very much with the previous speaker, but I would like to underline the other part of that equation. And that is, of course, that it needs to be relevant to donors, because otherwise there is no aid. And donors are also the ones that fund all the other development partners in financial institutions and international organizations. So I think that there must be some kind of cooperation. And I think it's very important, as I already alluded to, that you do a real stakeholder analysis and say, what is driving those donors, or rather those countries that ultimately fund this? What will they worry about over the next 10 or 20 years? And put it in that context. Because otherwise you can do all the research you want and it won't matter. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Johnny, for those reflections. Heiner, what are your thoughts?
Stefan, Heiner, sorry, brother, just a minute, Heiner, 10 seconds.
Sure.
You see, that makes the point that the colleague has just mentioned, that one needs to really be sure about the objective of the study and what one wants to look at it, the scope of it. Are we looking at effectiveness only on the ground, Are we looking at the process, or we are also looking at the effectiveness of motivation of giving the money? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deb. And I think just this discussion between Johnny and Deb, I think this is a very important one, and we should even have much more time to have a more detailed discussion on this aspect. Thank you, Deb, for this intervention. Heiner, over to you.
Yeah, also 2 points again. The first one picking up on Deb's comment on the global knowledge system, and I think it's really important to kind of remind ourselves of the starting point that, you know, this is in a way the system is rigged. Like especially in development studies, if you look at the academic field, most of the publications come from, you know, 90% of publications in high-profile journals come from European American universities. So there is clearly some imbalance in the knowledge system. And if you look at more kind of policy-based academic research, maybe it might be a bit better in that area. And this is probably what we're talking about today. But still, I think those imbalances exist. So I would very much second Deb's comment that the starting point has to be, you know, to look at which Southern institutions are in a good position to lead this type of research. And then the second comment would be on this challenge of then framing the questions and finding an angle to answer it. I think the new unique value added of the GPEDC is really to have this multi-stakeholder dialogue with kind of informed opinions from the country level on how they perceive the quality of the assistance that they receive. So I think it really has to be around that, but then you've got to be mindful of all the other activities that are going on, the review of this indicator set, for instance, that's happening. So how would your research in this field now differ from your reform of these indicators, for instance, would be really important for me. At the same time, I would frame the research very much along this kind of what I personally believe is the main value added of this platform is this: how do we capture these views from the partner side at the country level and integrate them into like a global discussion on what effectiveness is? So that would be my wish for an emphasis. Thank you.
Thank you, Heiner. Very important points. Before we get to the last two panelists for this round, just for the audience, this is your last chance to put some questions in the Q&A or the chat function. So if you have anything what you would like to ask, please just raise your questions in those two functions. Sam, what are your thoughts on those two questions, or one of them?
Thanks. I don't think I have a great deal more to add than has already been said. I would just emphasize the point that it's very important to start with what is the demand for this kind of research locally. So, you know, in Mozambique, for instance, what would the recipients of aid actually be interested in learning about aid and the aid effectiveness agenda? I think if we start with the questions and identify questions that there's buy-in to understanding better, then from there, it's easier to identify the relevant institutions and the institutions that have local credibility to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. And Tawasi, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think which research institutions, I can say Southern think tanks, universities, but they can collaborate with the Northern think tanks. I think that's not an issue. But I think the issue here is really there is a need for space for the local institution to participate in the agenda setting. I think this is really, really important, and this will have actually linkage to the question number 4. Because sometimes you find the think tanks from the South, the research agenda is already set, the questions are brought forward, and you're just being asked, would you like to partner on this specific research? Then this really creates a problem. So for number 4, how can we make these products become more relevant or have impact. I can say space for dialogue to see, where the demand is coming from, if it's from the donors or from the recipient country. I think there's space for dialogue and to see what exactly that is demanded. And most important also to be able to address the really local issues of concern, because once you have that, then the knowledge will be demanded. And then, so to stress who demands the knowledge, I think this is important. And one of the speakers say, also you have to feed on what the donor also wants to know, because at the end of the day, you want to leverage funding, but also there need to be a connection to the local context and what the local context really wants. So this is all I have to say for now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tawasi. Very important insights and really great to questions on those two big questions. With this, I think we should learn a bit about questions from the audience, and Irene and Yumna and others, you might be able to summarize some of the questions to us, to the panelists. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Stefan. Yes, well, the questions kind of reflect some of the questions coming up in the panel discussion. The issue around Southern voices in research and the kind of the points around, it's perfectly possible to undertake research in a partnership way, but where North-South power relations are maintained in undertaking research. That seems to be an issue that's coming up. And I think it would be interesting to think, maybe for people to give an opinion on whether kind of research interests, focus and skills differ between researchers from the South and researchers from the North. I mean, I've noticed in our discussion that we have Sam defending global level analysis and databases, and others talking about the importance of more qualitative research at country level. So that's one that's one question, I think, about how actually we could set up research, a research approach that kind of addresses this problem. And I think it also speaks to Deb's point about the importance of the analytical framework, and then from the beginning making sure that in developing an analytical framework that we have perspectives from both sides. Also, I think there's a question about where we want to focus, because effectiveness is at the different levels. So we deal with effectiveness as a global policy issue, as a policy issue decided on in the headquarters and political systems of donor countries or development partners, and as a practical issue for doing better in terms of delivering impact. Where should we focus on there? And as you've seen from the concept note, initially our idea of the focus is more at country level and sector level. So maybe a bit of a resolution about which of those areas we might try to focus on. And then the last point would be in relation to how to influence change and what sort of research is most likely to influence change. I think there's a strong discussion, strong line coming out that the way to influence change is to make sure that your audience or the target group, the people you're targeting for change, are involved in actually doing the research. So again, that's relevant to the previous question as well. Where are we focusing? And then who are our target group, and then how do we involve them? Sorry, that's an awful lot of questions. But,
Okay.
very much.
Great. Thank you so much for the summary of questions. That's great. Before I turn for a last round to our panelists, let me just give to you one nice additional task. How about just in one sentence, you have a PhD student or master student, and she or he is asking for a good research topic on this. So what is the working title you propose to this student, PhD student or master student? Maybe you start with this nice task, and then you can choose any question Ian was discussing. And let's change the order again. And how about we start with Yameli, Jane, Jose, Finn, etc. So we start with Yameli this time.
That you expect me to give the topic for my PhD student.
Right.
In Finland, the professor is not allowed to do it.
Yeah, but
if
you are a professor in another country.
Yes, but if I could be a PhD student now, and I could decide the topic what I could do, I would like to make a topic with connects to two countries in Africa, Tanzania and Mozambique. And the topic could be how to co-create of knowledge in environmental conflict resolution jointly with the private public people research partnerships.
Great, accepted. And any additional reflection on the questions Ian was discussing? Emily, if you want to discuss anything else what Ian was summarizing from the Q&A function.
Yes, I think that there it was very well summarized, but only what I have been following this discussion in the chat, the one issue which Vernon mentioned was this decolonization, because it's once we talk about the research as well, we need to be ready to decolonize our own thinking, our own attitude towards the not only the doing research, but the funding research.
Thank you so much.
Stefan, I had just a question to the organizers.
Yeah.
What happens next?
Maybe we ask this question after this round to Laurent and Ian. Yeah. Can you respond at the end to this question? That would be great. Jane, what is the topic you are proposing for your master or PhD student, if this is allowed?
Okay, good question. I would ask them to look at maybe the role of Southern think tanks in ensuring that the principles of effectiveness can deliver a better development impact.
Okay, and any question you want to address from Q&A function?
Okay, and no, I think the one that was addressed to me, I did respond directly on Q&A. Thank you.
Perfect, perfect. Jose, you are professor in Maputo, so what is your question to your PhD student or master student?
Well, thank you, Stefan. My question would be the local, the national, and the global development. Connecting the dots. What I mean by that? I think that it's obvious that development aid produces some results. It's obvious, okay? But the point is at what level and what kind of impact. And I think that it's very important for us to know how all these results are connected and what kind of impact has. And I think that this is the missing link that is very critical for us understanding development aid. On the question put on the chat, what I would say is that going back to this issue of involving Global South research institution, I think that it's also very important to have a very lucid approach on that because of the balance of the conditions in which research is developed and it's also disseminated and discussed. What I mean by that? The Global South in many countries, the conditions to do research and discuss research sometimes can be restrictive. And whilst it's very important for us to strengthen, and I much believe on that and I defend that, I think that it's very important for us to strike a balance between the need to strengthen the Global South, but also bear in mind what conditions can be restrictive to carry out research, disseminate, debate it, and see how to factor in the strategies that we are developing in research for this area as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jose. Finn, how about your student and anything from the Q&A function?
Thank you very much, Stefan. Let me first of all stress that I fully agree with Ernest's point about that it is critically important from the outset to be very clear about the specific focus that one adopts in a major research program. That's fundamental, both to the quality of the research that will be carried out, to the interpretation and understanding of what comes out of it, but also to the uptake that's supposed to come afterwards. From my perspective, one possible topic, I'm a little bit in the same situation that we also work very carefully not to define topics for our students. But let me just say that one possible way of approaching thinking about it is, can the incentives behind the demand and supply of aid be made more compatible with a view to increasing or improving the impact of development cooperation? I mean, that might be one way of approaching the topic. And let me just say that with those comments that have been raised regarding the collaboration between different researchers coming from different parts of the world, I mean, the RECOM program actually involved more than 300 researchers from 59 countries. 50% of UNU-wider research output during 10 years was co-authored by researchers from developing countries, 50%. It is possible to do it as long as we keep it focused in mind throughout, from beginning to end. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Finn. Tawasi, what are your final thoughts?
Thank you. Mine will be on aid in financing development, but the focus should be on understanding and promoting linkage between the productive and the social sectors.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you for, yeah, it's not a proposal, but you're thinking what might fly. Okay, great. Anything else? Tawasi?
I think so. That is a PhD question. That is what I had in mind. But what I would like to stress is really the space for the local institution to be involved in agenda setting. So this, I think, is very important as we are picking up and moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you for emphasizing this. Sam, how about your thinking?
Thanks. Yeah. So on a PhD topic, I might suggest something in the area of, analyzing or understanding the demand for foreign aid. Is there a quality-quantity trade-off? So, trying to understand whether recipients would be willing to trade the volume for higher quality aid. So that would be kind of an interesting understanding point. And I think there one would definitely need to collaborate with Southern institutions, would have the ability to actually ask those questions in a serious way and not get performative answers. So I think that would be an area of interest for me. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Heiner.
Yeah, I think I would choose the topic of aid modalities because from the framing of the discussion today, that sounded like a reasonable level of analysis. I think the caveat is that I don't think even if you had the perfect modality that would address all problems of effectiveness, but I think it could be a meaningful step to have better aid modalities. And maybe the innovative way to look at this question of what are the differences between different modalities is not to think them, from the provider side, but think them bottom up. So to have kind of really bottom up perspectives on what type of modalities of engagement are really demanded, what elements of existing modalities work better, which don't, because typically those decisions get made in Washington, DC at the World Bank, whether a project is an investment project, a results-based finance project, or a development policy lending. At the EU level, you have the similar instruments. So I think flipping that around and asking from the country level, what type of modalities work best for effective development cooperation could be interesting.
Perfect, thank you. Johnny, what is your thinking about this nice challenge? Is Johnny still with us? I don't see him here on the main screen. So then let's continue with Deb. And I see that Finn is you're raising your hand, maybe after Deb, and just for 1 second, yeah? Deb, how do you want to challenge your PhD or master's?
First of all, I do not agree that if you're doing a study, it is more like selecting a subject for PhD students. PhD students are novice in many ways. They're just struggling with the new knowledge and their eagerness to know more and earn a degree. But here we are talking about professionals who have given their career for the last decades studying this one. So we are not so novice over here. We are sitting on a wealth of information already over there. So this framing way of looking for a PhD thesis subject, I do not feel very comfortable with it. Anyway, let me come to the debate on the effectiveness debate has now two sets of issues over here. We have written about it. I have put some of the recent writings of mine in the chat box over there, including today's CGD blog published. So the first and foremost issue is that the outstanding issues coming from the effectiveness debate. And if you go back to the last Busan conference in Seoul, the December 2019, that was an expression, where do you take GPDC next? GPDC is an existential crisis. Let me put it softly. So then the issue is that what are those issues which we need to pursue and look at it to make effectiveness more effective? The second is that COVID has changed the circumstances. There are new issues which are coming up, intensification of the old one and the new game changers around town. So how do you really define the effectiveness? If there is one issue, I'm now falling for your trap. If there is one issue which I want to look at, then the effectiveness issue has to move out from the process assessment to the impact assessment. And the impact assessment, for which we have the SDGs, and the tagline is leave no one behind. To what extent the external finance is helping the national governments in reaching out to the poor. If that poor is effective, if they're being helped, the left behind people within their specific contextual realities, because the left behind people are diverse from country to country. And so how does this additional external finance help to reach out to the poor and help them come out from their development trap? I would think that is my question. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Deb. Finn, one sentence, final sentence from your side.
The final sentence was just that Johnny had to leave 5 minutes before. I thought he had managed to communicate to you. And if I may just then with one word on modalities say, it's not for lack of trying that we cannot say more on modalities. The problem is that we are a little bit in the same situation as we were in the macro aid effectiveness debate like 20 years ago, that the databases are still somewhat weak in reaching statistically significant conclusions. Maybe in about 10 years, when the databases will have been building up more, maybe we can then get into a situation where we can be more steadfast and more outspoken on modalities. The problem is, and that's what worries some of us, is that some people in the development debate, they use lack of statistical significance as proof that it doesn't work. And that's not allowed according to the statistical textbook. Lack of knowledge is not the same as lack of impact.
Okay.
I hope that was
so
sort of reasonably clear.
I think those are really important final thoughts. And we see that we could continue for another hour at least, but unfortunately we need to come to an end. But Deb raised a very valid question, what kind of, conclusions from the organizers might be drawn based on this discussion. And let me just give to Irnen or Laurent for a minute the floor.
Thanks, Stefan. I think Laurent also had to leave early. And I was hoping maybe I'll just say a couple of words now about what we're planning on doing next. But then if you want to, if you have some thoughts on summarizing the discussion, that would also be great. But just maybe I can't resist just intervening on one point, which is about the databases and the aid modalities discussion. I think if we look in the same way as when we look at aid and the impact of aid from a macro perspective, we can see that there are cases where it has positive impacts and the cases where it doesn't. And I think if you look at sector budget support in different sectors, you'll see the same thing. So you'll see the same modalities achieving very different development outcomes in different places. And that's really what we're trying to look at, is why is it that the effects of the same modalities are different? What is it that's working? That's what I think is interesting. This webinar was organized under the Action Area 1.1 on demonstrating the impact of effectiveness, part of the work program of the Global Partnership. And under this, we hope to undertake some research between now and the end of next year on this issue. So our next step will be, on the basis of the discussions here, to refine our thinking about the questions that came up, like where are we focusing, who are the target groups, what are the methodologies that we use, who are the best placed researchers to do this work. And then we will we'll do that, we'll look for interest, and we'll have a procurement process to run a fairly modest research project. The other thing that we will be doing is we hope to run an international research conference around the end of 2022 on this issue, and there will be a call for papers going out for that as well. So that will be separate from the research that we wish to undertake ourselves. In terms of this webinar, well, thank you very much for your participation. There's plenty of material there for us to take advantage of. Your thoughts in terms of specifying what we're going to do. The meeting has been recorded, and we will prepare a summary of it and make it available. And we will follow up directly with all of you in those processes. Okay,
great.
So thank you very much again.
Yeah, thank you so much for this important additional background and also to indicate where this discussion might lead to. And I think colleagues are very much interested in those things. So that's really good to know. Yeah. Happily for me, time is already over, so no time for a lengthy summary, but just 3 basic takeaways, not new, but based on what you mentioned. So the first one is, and I think many of you are totally right, we know already quite a lot, not everything, but we know already really a lot when it comes to based on quantitative and also qualitative research. That doesn't mean we could do more and to have more insights on a couple of topics based on data, better data, GPDC data monitoring around is something what is important and would probably need a more specific discussion. The modality discussion which came up at the end also illustrates that there is still a need for research, but we also should be aware about what is known already. This leads me to the second point, and I think we had very good discussions on this. Let's say the political economy context of aid. That this is something what is important. This is mainly the question walking the talk. If we know already quite a lot, why it's not really taken up by decision makers. How incentive systems might work on the side of development partners, but also partner countries. The whole discussion around perverse incentives would be quite interesting. I think what some of you mentioned, analytical frameworks reflecting realities on the local level. This is about political economy that we exclude quite often. This in our research, also series of change or action oriented, that research is important in terms of academic objectives, but also should lead to some kind of change. And in this regard, we also need to take into account the political economy. The last point, and I think this was beside many other highlights, but really my highlight, this kind of global knowledge relationship, powership, which creates this kind of situation that we do not have a lot of co-produced joint knowledge products. We do not have so much joint research, and I think some of you were highlighting, yes, sometimes we do things together, but then northern academic institutions are coming to southern countries saying, this is what we are going to do, do you want to partner or not? This is not really partnership. To involve local communities, local stakeholders as another point. And I think this is not just something what we should state somewhere that we want to do it, but to make it really part from the beginning. And this is also why I like this intervention about the funding structures for research, because this is the initial step, yeah, where we create first incentives, etc. So this kind of power relationship, knowledge relationship, and what does it mean for knowledge products? What does it mean for research is something what is really important, and really glad to see that this was such an important dimension of our discussion today. So let me really thank as a moderator, that was a fascinating discussion. 9 great panelists, always a challenge to push panelists, but in a way I found it really interactive. That was good. A lot of common ground, also some not conflicts, but good to see that we sometimes need to disagree, even on terms. And this is also why I'm happy about, why are we going to continue with term X or Z? I think we need to reflect on those things. So this is why I like to have those discussions, this open discussion, very open-minded discussion. So thank you so much, and let me thank the joint support team for the invitation to moderate this session, and looking forward to the follow-up by the joint support team. All the best to you. Have a great afternoon or morning or evening.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.